DLC is such a frustrating concept. When I think of DLC, both positive and negative emotions fill my mind. During the pre-Xbox 360 era of gaming, map packs, DLCs, and expansion packs were ways that developers could deliver more content to an already great game. Players bought these add-ons not because they were bored, but because it was even more that they could enjoy. Hell, some expansion packs like Brood War were literally just an informal sequel in terms of how much content they added. As publishers and developers noticed how well DLC and add-ons sold, they began pumping more money into post-launch content, and DLC roadmaps began getting planned out while the base game was still in the early stages of development. Games started to have shorter and shorter lifespans, and gamers were trained to burn through a game's content as fast as possible so the DLC a month or two later could sate their appetites for more content. Games weren't about the experience anymore, and in the last 5 or so years, we've seen how a game's release is traditionally seen as hollow and shallow, not even worth your time until the DLC comes out that makes it maybe worth your time. And even then, the player base will be so burnt out on the game itself that after that final DLC releases that fixes the game's issues, it just quickly dies after a month, making the whole thing just pointless. But we're starting to see games such as Warframe, Rainbow Six Siege, The Division of all things that were seemingly dead and buried a long time ago, slowly claw their way out of the grave and become popular years after they should have died. A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad, was a quote by famed developer Shigeru Miyamoto. In the days before patches and easily downloadable content, a game's first impressions were everything. Superman 64 couldn't be simply released and then patched and fixed later via updates and DLCs in its season pass. It had to be good or else. And it wasn't good. Like a Broadway play, games had to be incredible out of the box and catch the player's interest almost as soon as you booted up the game. This presentation also had to last the entire experience to keep its gamer engaged, whether it be through an increase in difficulty, the introduction of new toys to play with, or just a variety of other replayability options. Halo Combat Evolved made sure to introduce at least a new gun, vehicle, or enemy in every single level leading up to the ending. Sonic Adventure 2 offered the Chow Garden and a tiered scoring system with different objectives to make its levels replayable. Pokemon had different types of Pokemon to specialize in, which lent to its infamous replayability. Games had a lot of reasons to keep you coming back, and most importantly, these games never dropped their high-energy, high-engagement presentation. Side quests and RPGs mattered and rewarded you handsomely. Dialogue trees sent you spinning off in wildly different story directions. Levels were designed with hidden goodies like shields and alternate paths, and they rewarded you for hanging on to certain things that you picked up earlier in the level. It wasn't about completing a checklist of copy and paste activities on a minimap. It was about playing a game because you genuinely enjoyed it. All that changed with DLC. As internet connectivity became basically mainstream with the Xbox 360, map packs, DLCs, and add-ons became more easily downloadable for consumers, and therefore more easily accessible. The previous gen did have DLC, but it was nowhere near as ambitious as DLC during the next generation of systems. At first, it was small useless things such as the now infamous horse armor in Oblivion, but it quickly started to become genuinely awesome pieces of downloadable content that gamers were eager to download for the game that they were already hooked on. The best part was that these pieces of downloadable content felt like an aftermath response to gamer feedback on the base game, as opposed to something that was conceived and developed alongside the actual game. Oblivion saw the release of the Knights of the Nine and Shivering Isles expansion packs, with Shivering Isles in particular being absolutely fantastic. Call of Duty World at War's side Nazi zombies mode was a breakout thing, and in response, future map packs would deliver more Nazi zombies maps to survive on, with each map expanding on the previous map's ideas. As gamers bought more and more pieces of DLC, a change began to happen in the ways that gamers played games and developers designed games. Gamers' attention spans began to shorten. The online population of games began to dip a little bit more quickly than usual unless map packs came out in a steady stream. And on the developers' front, season passes started to become a thing. Essentially, you would buy the pass as a way to pre-order DLC before you even knew what the DLC was. Was this just a quick cash grab up front, or an artificial way of ensuring that the players wouldn't leave the game? Pretty soon, around the 2010s, we started to see DLC that included pretty substantial pieces of content, releasing suspiciously quickly, that would have made their respective games a lot more enjoyable if they were just included at launch. Some publishers even began dabbling in day one DLC that showed these pieces of content were probably cut from the actual game just to be sold as DLC. Games started to become more tedious to play as content became less enjoyable and became more checklisty in design. They couldn't stand on their own anymore, and only the promise of DLC would keep gamers coming back. Right out of the gate, the now current generation of consoles, the Xbox One and the PS4, housed the current style of AAA games, molded over the course of the previous generation's response to DLC. Games were no longer about the experience, it was about the promise of future DLC. Games came packaged with ads for future DLC. Ads for season passes were plastered all over main menus. Post-launch DLC and season passes were in some cases advertised for a game before actual gameplay was shown. Games felt like chores to play, endless side quests or boring checklist design to complete plagued most games as we slogged through, just imagining what the DLC we pre-ordered may bring to fix the experience. It was a dark couple of years for current gen console owners, but things only got worse. Due to how short the attention spans of gamers were falling off quickly. Games like Titanfall quickly learned that map packs that divide the player base into haves and have-nots were becoming unhealthy, as it just meant DLC owners had less players to play with, making them drop off the games even more quickly. The industry was in a sticky situation because now publishers were reorganizing and designing their whole revenue model off of how much money they could squeeze from the players after the initial purchase. And this is when it finally did get worse. Microtransactions and loot boxes. Games such as Halo 5 were able to find a solution to the issue of retaining its player base via DLC, but not dividing the ever-shrinking player base via paid DLC. What Halo 5 learned is to restructure the core of a game to push loot box sales and just make the DLC free. Loot boxes were beginning to get ingrained in modern games due to how it ensured that players couldn't be satisfied with a one-time purchase. This wasn't like purchasing a map pack. Using the same tactics slot machines in casinos use via a combination of noises, colors, and visuals that rewire your brain to get you caught in a compulsion loop that floods your brain with dopamine every time you open a box and get a reward with flashy visuals and the chance at maybe a fun prize. The most genius, or insidious, how you look at it, part of loot boxes is how, similar to a slot machine, you're not guaranteed that you'll get what you want, which means you need to spin that slot machine multiple times, sometimes hundreds of times before you finally get what you wanted. Games were also reworking their progression systems to make the act of ignoring loot box purchases a painfully boring grind. It was either treat this game like a second job by playing for hours in order to receive a couple free spins a day, or just cough up money now and maybe get exactly what you wanted. Now, publishers and developers were earning way more money than they ever had before because they compromised the design of their game into a slot machine that people were endlessly feeding dollar bills into. They would keep gamers at the current slot machine for a few months as they churned out free DLCs so that once that final DLC released for that particular game, the population would drop off instantly and move to their next slot machine, while the few stragglers left around were still inserting a bill or two here and there. So here we were. Games were no longer fun to replay, had very little staying power when compared to older games, and on top of it, the whole game's design was compromised to funnel players into a compulsion loop of gambling away their money for things that previous games would have had you going on epic quests for. Gaming became truly depressing. Games as a service is the name EA coined that the industry has sort of adopted to excuse the current state of modern games. The excuse is that the creepy and manipulative compromisation of modern games to focus on short-term revenue gain over long-term replay value and memorability is pardoned, 'cause free DLC. Some games have even tried to combine paid DLC and games as a service loot box models. In 2017, games such as EA's Battlefront 2 have shown that the games as a service loot box model can downright destroy what would be a promising game when developers and publishers compromise the game's progression system too much in favor of loot boxes. The old Battlefront 2 is still played and remembered fondly, while the new Battlefront 2 will be forgotten about in a few months, just like their previous Battlefront. The original Battlefront 2 was made with gamers in mind. The other was made with the gamers' wallets in mind. And aside from the gamers that are being manipulated, I feel bad for the poor little guys in the development studios who are doing texture work and not thinking about loot boxes or the best way to manipulate its audience into spending money. A friend of mine said it perfectly. I don't hate you, I hate your greedy boss. In theory, games as a service isn't a bad idea though. Games such as Rainbow Six Siege have demonstrated it can be done well and respectfully to its player bases. Now, Rainbow Six Siege did include loot boxes recently. It's something to watch carefully. But as of right now, the loot boxes don't feel that bad yet, but that's possibly because they're stapling a loot box system onto a game that wasn't designed with them. Give Ubisoft some time to make them intrusive, and I'm sure we will start to see an issue with Rainbow Six's loot box. Rainbow Six Siege is by no means flawless, but its incredibly depthful gameplay experience and amazing yearly release of new content instead of just making a sequel has created a game that we haven't seen in a long time. A game that's worth coming back to long term. In your personal opinion, what is a game that did or is doing the games as a service model well? And if you don't have an example, how would you create a game with long-term replay value or a games as a service model that respects its players instead of manipulates them? Alright guys, that's all we've got for today. I want you to comment what you think the next examining games should be on, and I will see you guys on the next video.